My name is Hilary. I live in Los Angeles now, but I grew up in Boston and New York City. I was in Christian Science. I was born into it and sort of slowly started to pull away from it in my 20s and have been completely out now for about 20 years. And I currently run a large international dance competition as a living.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of Generation Cult, a podcast about people who grew up in authoritarian fringe organizations, also known as cults. I'm Deanna, and thank you for listening. If you'd like to reach out, we're at generationcult@gmail.com. And if you want to support the show, check out our Patreon page. Today, we're going to be talking about Christian Science. This is the first time I've had anyone from Christian Science on the show, so I'm really glad to have connected with Hilary, who's going to be our guest today. Hilary grew up in Christian Science and now has her own YouTube show called Leaving Christian Science, which you should definitely check out as well. We're going to have a link to her show in our show notes. I feel like this group has really flown under the radar lately. You just don't hear a lot about it. There was some noise back in the 80s and 90s. I recall some litigation. Few cases were successful. They were regarding people dying from medical neglect, especially children. The founder, Mary Baker Eddy, basically taught that sickness wasn't real. It was an illusion, and that you could be healed if you knew the truth. Unfortunately, that led to and still does lead to some pretty agonizing and unnecessary deaths. We're going to talk more about that with someone who grew up with Christian Science and fortunately lived to talk about it. Hi, Hilary. Welcome.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you for being here and thanks for reaching out. Let's talk about your podcast first. What made you decide to start it?
It's interesting. I've asked myself that question a lot. Somewhere last summer, I'm very interested in cults. I'm one of these middle aged women that went from true crime to cults as sort of this pet obsession. And especially for me, I mean, I personally, my opinion is I grew up in a cult, Christian Science. So it was always of much interest to me to see what a cult is, how they operate, what's the line between religion and cult. My first obsession was Scientology, which is a group that Christian Science is often mistaken for just because of the name. We're very different.
Mm,
But yeah, so I've been doing a lot of sort of informal research about cults in general. And I had come across a lot of these storytelling podcasts where it was just people telling their personal experiences of having been in groups. I'm in a pretty active Facebook group for ex Christian scientists. And I thought, these people have some really compelling stories. And I know for me, I've been on a couple of other podcasts over the years talking about it. And I thought, why don't I just see if they'd be interested in telling me a story and I can throw together this sort of amateur podcast about just Christian Science. And sure enough, there were enough people that really, really wanted to talk about it and talk about what had happened to them. And so I created this podcast called Leaving Christian Science and put it on YouTube. We have the video version on YouTube and then an audio on all of the podcast channels. And it's just a very long form, it's usually 1.5 to 2 hours of just people telling their life story in this group. And mostly what's in there is there's a lot of medical stuff, people with medical issues or parents with medical issues. But there's also emotional neglect and just all sorts of psychological stuff that comes out of being in a group like that, which we'll talk about.
yeah. So, who is your typical guest? Is it usually people who grew up in Christian Science, or is it anyone who's been in Christian Science?
The interesting thing about Christian Science is because they've never really done any outreach, that's never been a part of the group. There's no missions, there's no going out and handing out pamphlets. It's really a very insular group that all of the people I've talked to were born into it. And most of them, if not all, were multi generational.
Hmm.
So Christian Science started in the second half of the 19th century. And some of the people I interviewed had great great grandparents that were part of that initial movement that were around when the founder was still alive. My mother found it in the 70s. She found it when she was pregnant with me. So I was born into it, but she was an adult convert, which is almost unheard of in Christian Science. It really is these multi-generational people who their entire family was in this group because their great-great-grandmother founded in 1905. That's the typical Christian Science story.
Wow. So they're not big on recruiting.
They really aren't. And it's interesting. And that's one of the things about it that when I was younger and in the group, I was very proud of. I was like, our truth is so true that we don't have to prove it to people. Because I imagined that people were just flocking to Christian Science, not understanding, like a lot of people in these groups don't understand. If they knew the true stats, they would see that their groups are actually on a rapid decline,
Yeah.
which is exactly what's happening with Christian Science. But in my mind, it was like, people just come to it because it's so awesome.
Yeah.
But nobody was coming to it. Like, no new people were coming into Christian Science at this point.
But I assume they're telling you that this is the way and everyone wants to do this. Or,
Yeah.
I mean, you must have been getting
Yeah.
that messaging from somebody.
I'm sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So I am curious then how your mom found out about it or your parents. Did both your parents get involved?
They did. I get the impression that my mother found it independently. She was married to my father, newly married to him at the time, and got him into it. And she managed to get her sister into it, who got her husband and children into it. So that's always been stunning to me that all of these other people got into this bizarre little group because of my mother's power of persuasion, which I think says a lot about her
Yeah.
because it's a pretty radical group. I mean, if you're asking people that grew up in a normal medical environment to suddenly turn your back on all of that and they agree to it, it's like my mother was her own little cult leader, you know?
No, that is interesting. So, most of these people who you've been talking to on your show who were part of Christian Science but left it, they were in because their family's history basically they could trace it back to the founder, like their grandparents, great grandparents were in it back when it started.
Yeah, some of them went even into the 19th century, like the late 1800s. Some were a little
Wow.
bit later. I think there were, like any religious group, there were moments where it was more popular than others. I think it was kind of popular like in the 30s and then in the 50s. And so it had these little bumps of popularity, probably related to a lot like Scientology, like a celebrity. There were
Mm.
a lot of celebrities, like Hollywood celebrities, that either dabbled in it or were full into the group. And so I think whenever like a celebrity would get involved, it would kind of spread a little bit for a while. Yeah. So a lot of the people that I've interviewed, they may not go way back, but they certainly go back at least a generation or two.
Mm.
It's always like a grandparent or great grandparent.
So, how would you describe Christian Science to someone who doesn't know much about it?
It started after the Civil War. As you mentioned, there's a woman, Mary Baker Eddy, who's the founder of the group. Another thing I was very proud of, by the way, was that it was founded by a woman, which, to be honest, is an accomplishment for the time. She
Definitely.
became a very, very powerful, wealthy woman, and that's something, I guess. The basic premise, it is a Christian group. I mean, it's a Protestant American religion. We read the King James Bible. We believed in Jesus and God, and there was a huge focus on that. So it's very Christian based. The core idea of Christian Science was we are God's perfect children. We're these spiritual beings. Anything material, physical is just an illusion that we have to overcome by, as you said, knowing the truth. That's the term that's used, that we are these perfect spiritual beings. And if that's true, we can't be sick. We can't die. All of that's an illusion. Death is an illusion. Illness is an illusion. It's just error. And so somehow, if we quote unquote know the truth, it'll fix these errors. So it sold itself as this sort of, honestly, like a wellness group back in the day.
Mm.
And you have to remember in the 1870s and 80s, materia medica wasn't so great. So
Yeah.
to instead go to a group like this rather than, having leeches put on you to solve the
Yeah.
illness,
Sounds more
you would probably get
appealing.
similar or better results.
Yeah.
So it made sense at the time.
Back then. It makes more sense
Yeah.
back then, I guess.
And
Yeah.
especially to a population that was very religious, that was very American Christian, I'm sure it felt great to, instead of going to this quack down the street, pray to God and have Jesus heal you. And heal the way Jesus did. That's the whole premise, is we can heal the way Jesus did. But the problem is we can't, and we never could. And it's not true or real in any way. And one of the most fascinating things to me is, why are there so many testimonies of Christian Science healing? I mean, there are entire books full of people telling their stories of having been miraculously healed through Christian Science. They have periodicals every week and every month that have a whole chapter of people talking about these miraculous healings. What is that? What causes that? Because I know that they're not real. So what is it? And I've looked into enough of the psychology of this stuff that, like you and I talked about earlier, placebo effect is huge. And also in Christian Science, you're not aware of illnesses in your body. One of the things that happens when you grew up in Christian Science is you're very much discouraged from learning about your physical body. Like some people in Christian Science, I'm not sure that we ever did this, but a lot of people sort of joke about how when they were Christian Science children, they'd be watching TV as a family, and if a medical commercial, like for aspirin or something, came on, they would turn it off or turn the volume down.
Oh, wow.
Like that was the
So it's just
extent.
like no medical anything,
Yeah. So you were
period.
completely medically ignorant. Like you had no idea how your body worked, how things healed themselves. So I think a lot of people consider something a healing that's just a normal body function.
Okay.
Because on Wednesday nights in the church, every Wednesday, you would go to what's called a testimony meeting, and everybody would go, and there'd be some readings from the Bible, and then people would stand up and tell about healings. And I certainly did this many times as a young person. And it was usually things like, well, I had a cold and it went away, or
Mm.
I had a fever and it prayed and it went away. And look back on all that now, and I'm like, yeah, that's just what they do.
You just heal.
Yeah, you just
It's
heal.
a correlation versus causation issue.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's people who don't understand science, who don't understand the human body,
Yeah.
and just assuming that something is related to something it isn't. And then there's also the fact that when you do the physical act of sitting down to pray, you're automatically doing self-care. So you're probably breathing deeply and focusing and clearing your mind of stress. Because I remember the act of praying. I mean, this is something we did all the time. And it felt really good. It felt very calming. It felt very peaceful. And so a lot of times, if anything you're experiencing is stress related, well, you're already halfway there just by the act of, I'm going to help myself. I'm going to do this thing, calm down, relax, feel
Yeah.
loved, feel God's presence.
It's like
It
meditation. I
is.
mean, that can calm you down and make you feel better. It's not gonna cure cancer, though.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's gonna make you feel a little
Yeah.
calmer,
For
but
those of us lucky enough to
yeah.
only have dealt with minor ailments, knock wood over here, it does seem like it works because you're not faced with a real illness. You're not faced with diabetes. You're not faced with cancer.
The thing I don't get, though, with this is why this total aversion to anything medical? I mean, if it's all an illusion, then why change the channel when something for aspirin comes on? Like, if it's all an illusion, then why does that even matter?
Good question.
Who cares?
Good question. Yeah. There are a lot of things that just don't make sense, like any religion. It doesn't make sense. There's no explanation as to why. And plenty of Christian scientists would say, well, that's not true. And you can still go to a doctor if you want, and you can still do this if you want, and no one's discouraging you. And I'm like, yes and no. Again, there's peer pressure, there's a feeling of failure if you go to a doctor.
Well, I can make a guess why they don't want you to do that.
Yeah,
I mean, I feel like I'm sounding like a broken record every time I talk about all these things, but it's a
it's a
control thing.
control
It's like,
thing.
well, if we stop you from looking at medical stuff, then you won't realize that that's probably what you
Yeah,
need.
and I mean, think about it. Like, let's say it's an emergency, which a lot of medical things are, and you're this Christian scientist who's completely medically ignorant. You don't have health insurance. You've never been to a doctor, and you have this medical emergency. What's the most logical thing to do? Is it to sit down and pray like you've done your whole life and you're convinced works? Or is it to, like, frantically try to find a doctor that you can go to with no insurance
Mhm.
and walk in there and say, I'm a Christian Scientist and I've never been to a doctor and I don't have any money and I don't have any insurance. Can you help me? Like, who's going to do that? Nobody's going to do that. They're going to sit down and pray and call their practitioner, which is the version of Christian Science doctor. It's basically someone you call who does prayerful work for you over the phone. And they're supposedly supposed to help you. And of course, they never do, but that's who you call when you have a problem. I called many in my young life, and they don't help. What's the most logical thing? Of course, you're going to do the thing that's familiar and comfortable and safe, and not do the thing that's scary and that's been implanted as a phobia in you your whole life. That doctors
Yeah.
are bad and they're going to hurt you and it's not going to work, and then you failed and everyone's going to shame you. You're not going to do that.
Yeah, there's a lot tied up in it, and I feel like it also says something about the state of our medical
Hmm.
system in the United States, but that's a
That's
whole
a whole other
other
thing.
topic, but it certainly doesn't help.
But yeah, I mean, I've read the very heartbreaking accounts of, because there have been children, obviously, who have died over the years in Christian Science because of medical neglect. And a few of the parents have very, gosh, what's the word, kindly, I guess, written out for us to read exactly what happened. They've left Christian Science, obviously, and are able to look back on that horrible traumatic experience with a clear head, and they explain exactly step by step what happened as their child was dying. And I find that a lot of what caused the whole situation is, like you said, control, coercion. Their church group said, we'll turn our back on you if you take this child to the doctor. That's going to harm them more than what you're doing now, and really set in this fear of complete isolation and being cast out. And again, like, is that supposed to be how Christian Science operates? I mean, it's not written in the bylaws that, like, this is what you do to a person when they take their child to the doctor. But interestingly, that's what always ends up happening.
I
It's
know.
just that's how human beings do stuff.
Yeah.
You're betraying us. We're going to throw you out. We're going to ignore you. That's just how we are, unfortunately.
And it also is an interesting example of how a cult doesn't need one leader. Like, you don't need one charismatic leader. I mean, I know that there was someone who founded it, but yeah, that was a really long time ago. She's not around anymore. I don't know the setup. I don't know if, each of the churches has a pastor or someone in charge, but from what you've been telling me, it sounds like a lot of the influence and the judgment comes from just the group itself, just the church. Is there someone who's saying, let's all judge this person? They took their kid to the doctor. I mean, what was your impression of that growing up?
Right. So, as you stated, the charismatic leader, she died in 1910. So, long before any of us were here. And that was one thing when I was trying to decide in my mind, do I think Christian Science is a cult? That was one sticking point for me, which was, well, we don't have a charismatic leader. We don't have this person. But I realized we do. It's just she's dead, but she's still there. She's very present. Every testimony meeting, the Wednesday night testimony meetings, every time you stand up to give your testimony, it starts with, I'd like to thank the discoverer and founder of Christian Science, Mary Baker Eddy, for blah, blah, blah.
Mm,
Her name is mentioned all the time. We all had pictures of her in our house. I had one until I was in my 30s in my bedroom, a little picture of Mary Baker Eddy. So her presence is very much there.
mm,
And she set the, like, a classic narcissist, set the church up to really only have her as an authority figure. When she died in 1910, she did not leave any sort of plan for someone to take over for her. There are no pastors, there's no priests, there's no officials, really. I mean, there's like a spokesperson, and I guess there's like a head of the church. But I mean, I wouldn't even know who that person is. Like, there isn't
mm.
a person that like decides things per se. It really still goes back to the church manual that she left in 1910. And so, like, your classic church will be what consists of a first reader and a second reader. And they're just elected by that church, and they serve a term where they basically just run the Sunday services and then the Wednesday evening testimony meetings. But they're not an authority figure. They're just sort of the part of the group that has to read from the Bible every Sunday for a while, and then it'll go on to some other person. And this was yet another thing that when I was in the group, I thought, this is why we're better than everybody, because we don't have some
Yeah.
guy editorializing and like making shit up.
Yeah.
And I thought that was great. We just have the word, we have the Bible, we have our little textbook, which is called Science and Health, which is the book Mary Baker Eddy wrote. And so every Sunday, you just read from these two books, and there's no modernizing, there's no trying to change it at all. It's just sort of eternally stuck in 1910. And I thought that was great. Of course, now I realize, oh, that's what a narcissist does. She didn't want anyone else to have any power, any control. She didn't want this changed. She didn't want people forgetting her name. Creepy, turns out.
Yeah, especially when you're dealing with health and science, because that constantly changes.
Yeah, a lot in 100 years.
Yeah, it evolves constantly. That's part of it. Like,
Yeah.
oh, this is wrong. It evolves for the better.
I'll posit that a lot of the group's decline is around that.
Oh, about like science getting,
Yeah,
yeah, better.
science
I mean, I don't know
advancing,
if that's the right word. Science getting more advanced,
more
the
advanced,
advancement
yeah.
of science and medical
Yeah, the
technology
advancement
and
of medical
research.
technology. I think people that aren't really, really sucked in probably said, "Sayonara, I'm not gonna risk my life when there are treatments now. What am I doing?"
Well, yeah, that's why it doesn't make as much sense now because back then there wasn't a lot of explanation for things and now you can get to the bottom of more medical problems and
Yeah.
explain more.
Yeah, and make people comfortable and extend their lives. And, I've had to, as a person who had no medical intervention until I was in my 30s, I've had to make my peace with the fact that medical stuff is not perfect. It's not going to heal everything, it's not going to fix everything.
Yeah,
But most of the time, it'll make your life better. Most of the
that is true.
time.
Let's talk more about your personal experience. Growing up, it sounds like you were proud of this. Did you ever have any medical problems or anything with this that you think back like, wow, I'm glad I came out of that okay?
Yeah, my sister's 10 years older than me, so she had a different experience with Christian Science than I did because I interviewed her on my podcast so we could compare and contrast our childhoods with this and our mother. I was always very proud of it. I thought it was the best thing ever, and we were on to this incredible truth about mankind, and I wanted to share it with everybody, and which is super embarrassing now. My sister was ashamed of it. She would hide it, and she would pretend she went to doctors when she didn't. And I
Mm.
think that's really interesting. And I've heard that from other people too. Because again, there's so few Christian scientists, and there really aren't Christian science schools. I mean, there's a couple, but most of us just went to normal schools. We had a normal environment of non Christian science people around us. And so for some people, they would hide it and they were ashamed of it, especially because it would isolate you at school. I mean, I don't think we went to this extreme, but we did have exemption cards, like official government exemption cards from taking biology, from certain sciences that were about medical things, from taking health class, certainly from vaccinations. I had that one. I had the no vax, no medical card. I remember that, this little yellow card that we give to each school I went to. But I did take the classes, thankfully. I took the health class, learned what a period was. Thank you very much. I'm glad I knew those things.
Yeah,
But my sister and I both super lucked out because we were just healthy kids.
good.
We didn't have chronic illnesses, we didn't have accidents. And I think part of the reason we didn't have accidents is because we were very, very careful, which a lot of Christian Science kids are. We didn't take physical risks because we knew we weren't going to get helped. Somehow, deep down, we knew if I break my leg, I don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah,
So I've always been like that. I've been very, very cautious with physical things to this day.
yeah.
But there was one incident that really stuck out in my mind because I always had this question of, would my mother have taken me to a doctor if something bad enough happened, or would I have been one of those statistics? So when I was around 12, I got some sort of abdominal pain that was really excruciating, really excruciating. If I remember it with my adult brain, it felt like labor pains,
Mm.
like unbearable. Like I was moaning and crying and rolling around. And this went on pretty much all day. And my mother was there. And of course, we were calling practitioners and reading the books and praying. I mean, she wasn't ignoring me for sure. And I'm sure as a mother, she was alarmed to some extent, but she didn't take me anywhere. She didn't call an ambulance. And at one point, she even said I should keep my voice down because she didn't want the neighbors calling the cops.
Oh, ouch.
She did say that. She denied it later, but she did say that. Because in our house, there was always this fear of And she would even say, if people knew how we live, they would take you away from me. Don't tell people that you don't go to doctors. Don't tell people about this stuff because they won't understand and they'll call CPS and they'll take you away.
Wow. Do you remember having any thoughts about that? Like thinking that was weird?
Um, it definitely made me afraid.
Like of being taken away
Yeah,
or yeah.
yeah. Because my dad was out of the picture. So just me and my single mother. My sister, by this time, she was an adult, so she was off on her own. So it was just me and my
Oh,
mother.
yeah, that's who you depend on.
Yeah, there was a super dependent relationship. So yeah, as much as I talked about Christian Science to other children, there was also this feeling of, well, I can't really get into the medical details so much because that could get us in trouble. So what ended up happening with the abdominal thing, like so many illnesses, it just went away
Good.
after all that. And I thought I was dying. I thought my appendix had burst and I was dying because I knew at least what an appendix was. But it just stopped after many hours. And that was the end of that.
And you were just fine?
Yeah, it was fine.
Ugh, I'm glad you were okay, but
Yeah.
wow.
Who knows
Yeah.
what that, I'll never know what that was. It might have been an
Oh my god.
obstructed bowel. It might have been like a cyst, like an ovarian thing. I don't
Yeah.
know.
Yeah, I've had one of those. It's really, really painful.
Very painful. But I remember my mother saying, because I later in life brought up that incident and sort of accused her, like, you didn't get me any help. And she said, well, I wasn't like those other demented CS moms. That's the term she used, demented CS moms. Like I would have taken you somewhere if you've been really in trouble. And I was like, really? Because you didn't take me anywhere that time and I could have died. Like we didn't know what that was. It could have been anything. I could have been poisoned. I could have been,
Yeah.
So I'll never know. I'll never know if my mother would have just watched me die
Oh my god.
or or if she would have finally gotten me some medical help. I don't know.
Did you see that happen to anyone else in your church?
I never knew anyone that died, although I will say I knew a couple of adults that had children that died, but I'll say that they did get medical care for the kids.
Mm.
They did see a doctor, but and I'll never know the answer to this for sure, but I think they probably did the Christian Science thing where they waited too long. And that's why the children didn't make it.
Um,
There was an infant that died that we knew, and there was a little kid that had cancer. And I don't know for sure. I don't want to accuse anybody of anything, but
yeah.
let's just say it's a common thing for Christian Science children to they will get medical care eventually because the parents sort of panic and go, oh my God, okay, we obviously can't handle this through prayer. Let's get her to a doctor, which is a correct impulse. But if you've waited a really long time, sometimes it can't be helped at that point.
Do you remember at any point realizing something was wrong or different? Because you said you would talk to other kids about Christian Science. Did any of them say something like, "Oh, that doesn't sound right"?
It's funny because I remember one girl was another religion. I think she was Baptist or something like that. And so she and I would have these endless debates about our religions. And it never
Mm,
really went anywhere. Because those
mm,
debates just go around in circles because it's all faith stuff. It's none of it is based in any kind of reality. So it wasn't until I had boyfriends later in my teens where they would start challenging me. And I'll say the reason they challenged me was because I wouldn't sleep with them.
oh, so it wasn't
And I
even
would,
about the medical stuff.
no, no, that was the thing that affected them. So suddenly it mattered. So, like later in my teens, I had a couple of boyfriends that pushed back really hard, and it's because I refused to have sex with them, which honestly was a correct impulse. I'm glad I did that. But yeah, so I didn't get a ton of pushback early on, but I will say that the question started for me when I was around 11, 12, when you first start having the beginnings of like an adult brain, adult reasoning, because it never made sense to me that in Christian Science, if everything is an illusion and our whole purpose here is to prove it or know it, or however you want to put it, that our material existence is an illusion, why do we spend so much time in prayer to prove that something's unreal if it's unreal because there's so much time put into this. We study the Bible and science and health every single day of the week. We read something called the lesson, where you sit for like an hour every morning before school and read these two books together, and you read the same thing every single day. And then on Sunday, they read it back to you. So it's this endless repetition of these same Bible phrases and same things coming out of science and health paragraphs. And it's all to guard against what's called animal magnetism, which is sort of like the boogeyman in Christian Science. It's the thing that's trying to convince you that all of this is real. But we don't believe in a devil, but that kind of is our devil. So it's like, as much as I thought, well, we don't believe in hell, we don't believe in sin, and we don't believe in devils, like we had all of those things. They were just called something else. And I
Yeah.
was like, well, what is this animal magnetism? I thought none of this was real. Why is this
Yeah.
suddenly real and we have to fight against it and guard our thought against these thoughts? And why is there any struggle? There shouldn't be any struggle if we're all perfect children of God. So why are we doing all of this? It doesn't make sense,
Yeah.
you know? And I kept diaries all this time during my life. And I called this particular problem, I called it the question. And I remember writing about that in my diaries endlessly. Like, this week, I'm really being bothered by the question and I just can't figure it out. And so I bring this up over and over again. Like, I'm still struggling with the question. But again, the family culture and the culture of your church and just the imagined comfort of God, this omnipresent God looking out for you as this benign force, was too compelling for me to have the strength to say I'm out. It was too much. I mean, especially if you look at my particular psychology as this child with a narcissistic mother, let's call it what it is. She had her mental health stuff. She was very depressed and very narcissistic and very selfish. I, for one, desperately needed that perfect, loving parent, which really was Christian Science slash God.
Mm.
I think it was that much harder for me to break away. And even when I started to become an atheist later in my early 30s, I remember I went on a date with this guy who had been the son of a pastor's, and he was leaving his religion too. And we kind of compared notes about that, and how I was saying, yeah, I'm just kind of not believing in God anymore. And he said, yeah, it's like the death of a parent
Mm.
when you let go of God. And that's been the most true thing anyone has said to me. It really was that when I finally came to my current belief system, which is atheism, that there is no God. It was a tremendous loss. It was really the loss of this loving, perfect parent. And I just felt completely untethered in the world and completely lost. And I've heard that from a lot of people that grow up very, very God believing, that when you finally get to the point where you're like, I just can't, this just doesn't make sense anymore. I can't. It's a tremendous loss. It was a lengthy mourning period for me.
How did you manage that? Assuming you're in a good place now, it seems like you're in a good place
I'm
now.
in a great place
Yeah,
now.
how would you recommend anyone else going through something like that, manage something like that?
I can't say I managed it particularly well. I think I sunk into a pretty intense depression for a few years. I listened to a lot of Radiohead, which didn't help. But, it just took time. It's not something that you can just snap out of. It took many years, and finally I got to a very good place of realizing that the chaos that I now believe is in charge of our lives on this planet, that everything is just sort of random, is actually really beautiful and really freeing and very comforting in an odd way. Because suddenly you don't have to explain things to yourself like, well, why do good things happen to bad people? And why do bad people seem to get away with things? And why are there wars and natural disasters and children with cancer? Why are there all these terrible things? When you're a religious person who believes in this all loving, almighty God, you can never really make peace with the reality of human life. It doesn't match up with what you're being taught in church, where everything is good and everything is perfect. And you look around and you're like, but I'm not seeing that. I'm seeing a lot of really terrible things. So in a way, it's very freeing to realize, oh, that's why. It is what it is. It's just nature.
So, did you get to that point kind of all at once when you were rejecting Christian Science, or did you get past Christian Science and were still religious and then slowly start moving toward atheism? Like, what did that process look like for you?
Yeah. So when I moved to LA in my early 20s, I got together with a group of other sort of like-minded Christian scientists, and we all had similar issues with the church itself and just organized religion in general. So we decided, well, we're not going to go to the church. We're not going to go to a church anymore, but we're going to form our own little group. Like they call it a society. We're going to make this sort of different group and we're going to kind of think differently. So that was like step one was, well, I don't believe in like the church as it's presented, but I'm going to do this other thing, but it's still going to be called that.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
And then just over time, I didn't want to do that anymore either. I think I was sick of all the work it took to be a Christian Scientist, the constant studying and praying and reading and buying periodicals and participating. And I was getting on with my life. I was a young woman trying to start a career and I had other things I had to do. So the work of it kind of slipped away. So I didn't really participate anymore. I didn't read the things. I didn't go to the church, but I still obviously was not going to a doctor because at that point I was young and healthy. I didn't need to. There was no reason to go to a doctor. But I was still, well, I still believe in the basic principles. I still believe there's something about Christian Science that's true and good, but I'm just not really going to participate. And then over time, you start to examine it a little more and you realize, I think this isn't true. I don't think this works. And I think it harms people. And I couldn't call myself a Christian Scientist anymore, but I still believed in God. And honestly, it really had never occurred to me that there was a chance there was no God. And then one day, just like in Julia Sweeney's Letting Go of God, which was very instrumental to me at this point, it's one woman show that the actress Julia Sweeney does about her leaving her Catholic faith. A little voice just said to me, what if there was no God? Why don't you walk around today and just see what it would feel like to not have that belief for the first time in your life? And I'll say, like I said earlier, it was scary, but it was also exciting. This thought of, well, that would certainly explain a lot of the things I've been experiencing over the last 30 years. And the only thing that makes sense is that it's all chaos and we just need to look after each other and enjoy our lives as best we can. That's it.
Yeah.
Simple.
Yeah. It all depends on the person. Like some people find it comforting and some people just can't.
And I get that. I would never try to push my thing on other people.
Oh, no, totally.
Everyone's where they're at.
That's
yeah.
the problem to begin with, right?
Mm-hmm.
Pushing belief onto people and expecting people to like, this works for me, so you need to do this. That's where we all got into
very
this mess
anti that
to begin with. I'm curious about your first experiences, though, getting medical care. Was that unsettling?
Yeah, it was scary. I feel like after, because it's been probably 20 years now since I first started seeing doctors, I feel like I'm pretty much over the medical fear at this point, but it was very scary in the beginning because there was a feeling of first not understanding it because you haven't been going to doctors since you were a baby. You have no idea what that's even like. And there was a lot of shame about it. There was still early on this feeling of I've failed. This makes me a failure because I couldn't manage this thing on my own. Yeah, I had to work through a lot of that. And I know a lot of former Christian Scientists have a similar feeling of the fear and the phobias that are put in you growing up in Christian Science, and then the feeling of like, well, this is kind of what you do when you're not good enough to heal yourself, which is just ridiculous.
Like you failed in some way.
You failed, yeah. But mainly for me, I had 2 children in my late 30s and early 40s. And as you know, that's if you choose to go through a hospital, which I did. It can be a very, very, very intensely medical experience. Lots of doctor visits, lots of blood draws, lots of invasive things being done to you all the time. And then the actual birth itself, very medical. Staying in a hospital, which I'd never done before. And so that was sort of like just being thrown into the frying pan. But I wanted the babies enough, and I was like, you know what? This is what it is. And I just have to trust in these people, that they're good people, they're helping me, and this is a joyful experience. And, and I just had to get over it. I just had to bite the bullet and say, this is what I need to do to get to having a child. So it's going to be okay. And it was. I mean, it sucked. Labor sucks,
Yeah.
But it all worked out.
Yeah, no, I only did it once, and I was like, I'm not doing this again.
Yeah, I had a similar reaction, like, nope, that's not happening again.
That's it.
but it
That's it
did.
for me.
But I'd like to talk briefly about my sister and I. We lucked out because we got out of this before we were elderly.
Yeah.
So we got to have pretty healthy lives, even with no medical intervention. However, our mother and many Christian Scientist parents don't have that experience. So what happened with our mother was she had some mysterious ailment, probably from around the time she was around my age. She started off with a lot of UTIs and a lot of pain sort of in her bladder area, and it would kind of come and go. Sometimes she'd be fine, and then other times she'd be in agony, and she'd call a practitioner, and it would seem to get better. And we just didn't really think much about it. And then we all had a big family blow up, and my sister and I both stopped talking to her. So we were alienated from her for the most part, and she lived in another country. So there was no easy way to get to her. It was all very confusing. But she just got sicker and sicker and more isolated. And we would hear, from people who were in touch with her that she wasn't leaving her apartment. She was having her groceries delivered. She wasn't seeing any friends. We knew she was dying and had probably been in the process of dying for a good 10 years or so.
And this was after you left Christian Science, I
Yeah.
assume.
And actually, our split was because I left Christian Science. I told her finally that I didn't believe in it anymore. And she pretty much cut me out of her life entirely.
Yeah, I was wondering about that. I was wondering how she took that.
Yeah, again, she was in Brazil at the time. She was far away.
Oh, she moved to Brazil.
Yeah. And long story there, but it does make sense if you know who she is. So she was living in Brazil, and we would keep in touch via Skype. This was like the early 2000s, and I finally worked up the courage to tell her straight up, I'm out. I don't believe in this anymore, which I sensed that she would find a way to completely shun me if I told her this. And that's exactly what happened. I was supposed to go visit her a few months after that. And she told me, I feel like because of your negativity towards Christian Science, that being in physical proximity to you would be detrimental to my health. And I need to look after myself now.
Yeah, she made it your fault.
Yeah, it was my fault. I was
Yeah,
toxic now because I no
yeah,
longer
yeah, of
believed.
course,
And even
of
just being
course.
around her would cause her, she even said that I might kill her.
Yes, she had to protect herself from you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was the end of our relationship.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Complete end, which was horrific. And for the next 12 years, she just slowly died in her little studio apartment. And so one day in 2018, we get the call that she's been discovered after having been dead for we don't know how long in this little
Oh my
place.
god.
And it was horrific. I mean,
Oh, how
it's
horrible.
it's this nightmarish end to this woman's life who did not deserve that.
Yeah.
We don't know what she died of. We couldn't get an autopsy because it had been too long that she'd been in there, so we couldn't get an
Oh my
autopsy.
god.
But she actually left a computer with some recordings. She made some audio recordings, and she mentioned in them that she thought she had cancer. And I think that's probably what happened. And imagine dying of cancer alone in an apartment with no medical intervention, no pain remediation. I mean, it must have been absolute
It's
agony.
horrible and
Yeah,
so
horrible.
unnecessary.
Unnecessary. We call it a Christian Science death because unfortunately, unless you're magically healthy into your 90s, which some people are, and you
Yeah.
just have a heart attack in your sleep and you're fine, most people will have something. Most people will have some cancer or some Parkinson's or something as we get into our 70s and 80s. We're not going to just be perfectly healthy.
Yeah, we're human.
Yeah.
That's what
So
happens.
that's the sad thing is Christian Science, you can pull it off for decades, but once you become an elderly person, things start to fall apart. And unfortunately, at that point, like what had happened with my mother, she was so afraid of getting medical help because we did talk about this earlier when we were still in touch. It would come up occasionally, and she'd say bizarre things like, well, if I go to a doctor, they're just going to start finding things.
Yeah,
And I'm like, well,
that
yeah,
doesn't make them not there.
exactly. But I've told other Christian Scientists that she said that, and they're like, "Yeah, that's what my parents would say." Well, they're just gonna find stuff. Well, yeah, what are you talking
Well,
about?
yeah,
Like, what is
that that doesn't make reality not exist.
yeah, so I'll have to say because most of the people in our ex-Christian Scientist Facebook group, I mean, not all, but I would say a majority are probably around my age. So most of us have elderly parents, parents in their 70s and 80s. And a lot, like 80% of what we talk about in that group is having parents that are dying these horrible deaths.
Oh my
And
god.
what do we do? Can we help them? Can we
Yeah.
intervene? I mean, at one point, my sister and I think we called Rick Ross, the cult specialist, that we called him up and asked, can we do an intervention on our mother? Can we just like go to Brazil with you or somebody and like knock on her door and like demand she go to a doctor? So we actually were in the process of trying to set something like that up when I talked to my aunt, my mother's sister, who by this time had long left Christian Science. And she said, it's not going to work. Like, you girls can do this. I'm sure she'd be happy to see you, but I wouldn't waste thousands of dollars on that
Yeah,
because she's never going to leave Christian Science. She's just not.
it's true.
So that was the end of the intervention idea.
Yeah, if somebody doesn't wanna leave it, you can't make them.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's just nothing you can I mean, you can say, "I'll be here for you if you leave," but
Yeah. And that's the heartbreaking
you
part.
can't force it if someone really wants to stay.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's so sad, though, in that circumstance, and I'm so sorry. I'm so
Thank you.
sorry that
Yeah.
your circle is just going through this.
I can talk about it and sound very detached now because I feel like I started mourning her when we split up, which was now a very long time ago.
Yeah.
So I've gotten the grief out of my system. So when she actually died, it was just sort of an extension of that. Because to me, she had already died for me. But I'll say that one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this on your podcast was, as much as Christian Science, I think in recent years has sort of loosened its grip on the whole "don't go to doctors" thing. I actually found an article in The Guardian from 2010 that said that they had pretty much like renounced that whole concept, which
Oh,
was shocking to me.
wow.
I don't know what Christian Science is without the
Yeah.
anti-medical thing. That's pretty its whole jam. So I think people growing up in Christian Science now probably have a much more normal experience. They get vaccines, they get their checkups, and that's
Right.
great. I'm glad people's health is being protected. But there's this whole generation of elderly Christian Scientists that are dying these hideous deaths. They have facilities for these people, these nursing homes that a lot of them will go to. And there are things called Christian Science nurses who aren't real nurses. They don't give them any medical care. They just sort of clean their wounds and make sure they are fed, and that's it. And I've heard stories. I have not been in one of these places, but I've heard stories from people who have had parents in them or been in them or worked in them where it's just, you can hear the
Oh
screams
my god.
of this agony of people dying of giant skin cancers taking over their faces, and untreated diabetes, and losing a foot, and it's just there rotting for months and years and nobody does anything about it. I mean, that's elder abuse. It's elder abuse,
Absolutely. Yeah, that's
but
horrifying.
it's under the guise of religious freedom,
Yeah,
and it's infuriating to me.
and it's even more infuriating because there's like, what do you do?
Yeah. And so in our situation, because honestly, when we split, I knew that this would happen to her. Like, deep down, I knew she would have one of these horrible deaths. And so there was a part of me that was happy to distance myself
Yeah.
because I was like, I can't just stand by and watch you die. I didn't say that, obviously, but back in the back of my head, there was always this fear of like, we're going to have to watch her die like this, and we're not going to be able to do anything about it, and it's going to be horrendous. So at least we were spared having to be involved in any of that. But I really feel for the people who are still in their parents' lives, which is most people, and they're having to they're in the group saying, what do I do? What do I do? I want to help them. What do I do? And the answer is nothing. So Christian Science, it has this air of respectability, but people need to know what really goes on. And there may not be children dying, which is great. I'm glad that's a new thing that's not happening anymore. But what happens to all these elderly people? Some may go to doctors, and that's fine, but the majority of them that were really, really, they call it radical reliance. That's the term, when you just will not have any medication at all. That's what we were. They will die like that.
Yeah.
And it's horrific.
It's horrific, and
Horrific.
it's not even something you're gonna hear about because,
No, nobody knows about it.
it goes quietly
It's
and
all shrouded in secrecy and underneath the banner of religious freedom.
yeah, religious freedom.
Are
Yeah,
Cursed into harming themselves, having unnecessary agony and misery. It breaks my heart.
and it's an impossible situation, heartbreaking, and I feel so bad for your group of people. That must be really hard. I mean, you're not dealing with it personally right now, but you're probably having to go through it over and over again, watching all these other people,
Yeah.
like, and knowing how that feels.
Yeah, and I think that's why somehow I get some comfort from hearing about other high control groups. I mean, that's why I obsessively watch The Vow over and over again, and I look at Catherine Oxenberg and I feel her pain. You have this loved one in this group and they're actively being harmed and they don't want to leave. And what can you do? Just the agony of that.
Well, you realize how universal it can be, the experience of watching something like
Yeah.
that, and then also realizing that the other person has autonomy, even if they're doing something that you just so don't agree with.
Yeah. And you know they're actively being harmed and
Yeah,
possibly harming other people.
yeah.
And you just can't legally do anything. You can't.
Even ethically, yeah, I mean, some might argue, about that, but
Yeah.
yeah, it's really tough. I know, it's why people don't like this topic at all.
Yeah, because it's so frustrating. And
Yeah.
and if someone would ask, "Well, what would you want to do about, let's say, these facilities?" I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I wish they weren't getting government money. They get
Oh, they do, they get
Medicare,
yeah.
which probably shouldn't happen, but other than that, I'm like, well, you can't go in there and, like, round everybody up and
No,
force them to go to a hospital, like, you can't do that, so
because
what
they don't
hey,
want to.
they don't want to?
Yeah, if they don't want to, like, what are you gonna do? Be like, "Okay, then go home." They probably feel better being there, maybe? Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know what the answer is.
Yeah, there's no answer. It's just a super messed up situation.
I wish I knew the answer to any of this. And I'm just dealing with it by talking about it, but yeah, I don't know if there
Yeah.
is a
Yeah,
solution.
I think that's part of the reason I wanted to do the podcast, as much as I know it'll never have a huge reach because it's such a niche topic. I feel like nobody knows about this.
Yeah,
Everybody walks by Christian Science reading rooms that are in every little town and city, and they're just like, "Oh, what's that?" And then forget about it. And I'm here to say, well, this is what that is. You wonder what that reading room is? That it's this, and this is what it causes. This is how it ends up.
I'm glad you're talking about it. I think people should know. I know it's frustrating to know about something awful and not be able to do anything about it, and I know that some people would rather just not know, but
Yeah.
there are others that want to know. For some reason, I feel better knowing.
I do too. Yeah. I'd rather get all the information I can
Yeah,
about these groups. And one of the reasons I wanted to do the podcast too is because I feel like I've really fought my way out of depression and anxiety and a real darkness that kind of permeated my life for many, many years. And it's been a lot of work. It's been a lot of therapy, but there is light at the end of the tunnel that you can actually grow up in this crazy religious cult like I did with a narcissistic mother that basically committed religious suicide. I mean, that's what I call it. And still have a happy life. You can live through all of those crazy things. Like I built a lovely life for myself and there's happiness on the other side. There can
yeah,
be, you know?
absolutely. Well, thank you so much for sharing your story and for creating a show. I feel like I'm seeing it more and more that people are getting out there and sharing more and also doing their own shows, and I'm loving it.
Yeah, me too. I listen to them all. I'm endlessly fascinated.
Me too. It's so great to hear people's stories from their perspective. I love unbiased coverage too, with the journalism background. But then there is something like, I don't know, just like hearing about someone's personal experience is so meaningful and you get so much out of that. And I love that people feel comfortable coming forward and talking about these topics like religion and leaving these communities that were so meaningful to them and their families and the upsides and the downsides because these are such tough things to talk about. So thank you again for your time and for reaching out and your podcast. Good luck with that.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to try to do a season 2 if people want to be interviewed. So if anybody wants to be on Leaving Christian Science, hit up leavingcspod@gmail.com to tell your story.
Great.
All right. Thanks so much for having me.
Generation Cult is hosted and produced by me, Deanna Levy, with original music by Lee Dunn and opening and closing tune by the band The Chaw. If you like the show, please go and leave us a 5-star review. Thank you for listening.